So I had a question this morning from one of the moms in the private Facebook group about spitting up in her baby. So today in this video, we're going to talk to you about 4 reasons why your baby could possibly be spitting up and what you can do about those. So let's go ahead and start. So 4 reasons that your baby could be spitting up. One of those could be overfeeding. Another could be oversupply of breast milk and a forceful milk ejection reflex. The other one could be milk protein allergy. And the one that people most often talk about is gastroesophageal reflux. So let's talk about those one by one. Overfeeding is probably a pretty common reason why your baby could be spitting up. So we have to consider that babies' tummies are really, really tiny, like the size of their fist. And babies oftentimes will feed too much, or we will feed babies too much because, they can't feed themselves. And so oftentimes you have to think about, is your baby hungry or is your baby sleepy? And it's very difficult in the beginning to know the difference in those. And so when I talk to parents about babies who are fussy or babies who are spitting up, babies who are irritable, a lot of times when I ask them to keep a log for me and I look at that, I can sometimes figure out that the baby is being fed when they're sleepy instead of when they're hungry. And oftentimes when that happens, babies will spit up a lot because their tummy is so tiny, it can only hold, just so much milk. And so if you're trying to figure out one of the reasons why your baby's spitting up, you might start keeping a log of when your baby wakes up, when your baby goes to bed, when your baby's taking a nap, and when you're feeding the baby. And in that log, start looking at your baby's hunger cues and your baby's sleep cues. And you might be saying, I don't even know what you're talking about. So start looking at the activities and the behaviors that your baby shows when your baby's hungry and when your baby's sleepy. Some of those look very similar in the beginning, but you'll start to notice a difference. And even with breastfed babies, you can put your baby on somewhat of a little schedule. I'm not very regimented with that, but you'll start to see that your baby, even breastfed babies, should feed about every 2 to 3 hours, and they sleep much more frequently than that. So you don't have to feed your baby to get your baby to sleep. But oftentimes you'll think your baby's hungry, and so you'll be feeding your baby much more often than they need to feed to get them to sleep. And so sometimes babies will spit up because you're feeding them too much, whether that's breast milk or formula. Now, formula lasts a lot longer in the tummy. Breastfed milk breaks down much easier, and so it doesn't last in the tummy as long. So particularly for a formula-fed baby, if you're feeding your baby too often, they've got a lot of milk still sitting in the tummy that hasn't digested, and they will spit up much more frequently. But breastfed babies will spit up a lot too if you're feeding them too often because they just still have too much milk in their tummy. So start looking at your hunger cues and your sleep cues and see if you're feeding your baby when they're sleepy and not really hungry. And that may be one cue for you. Now, the second one is oversupply of breast milk. Now, you might not see this in the very beginning, and this is kind of a cue for you when your baby started spitting up. So if your baby starts spitting up a couple of weeks in, it might give you a little idea here. But some moms have oversupply in the very beginning. This is particularly true if you're pumping breast milk very early on. And I'm not talking about moms who are pumping for babies in the NICU, but I'm talking about moms who have a full-term baby with no health problems, and you're feeding your baby and you're pumping too, maybe trying to establish your milk supply really early, or maybe you're thinking you're going back to work, and so you're feeding your baby and you're pumping in those first weeks of life. Sometimes you'll build up too much of a milk supply. And some moms just ordinarily have an oversupply of milk. And you'll notice this because your baby will be feeding, and then all of a sudden the baby will pull off and be choking and and sputtering and gagging a little bit, and then have to put themselves back on. The other thing that you'll notice with that is that your baby will be feeding, will latch on and be feeding, and then all of a sudden you'll notice that baby's feeding really, really fast. Sometimes you'll notice that the baby is extra spitty, spits up a lot right after the feeding. Sometimes the baby's really gassy. Sometimes those babies have really frothy, bubbly green stools, and that's because they're getting a lot of milk, and they have a hard time handling this overproduction of milk that you have. And you'll notice that your breasts are really full. So that's kind of a cue that you might have an oversupply. And you may notice that yourself. You may notice when you have that letdown of milk and the baby's pulling off and, kind of having a hard time handling that. Another thing with these babies is they may not be babies that really want to comfort feed. They oftentimes are babies that just want to feed just for feedings, but they're not babies that will just feed like when they're sleepy. Because of that oversupply, it's almost difficult for them. They seem to fight at the breast sometimes because they have a hard time handling that flow of milk. So that may be one reason why your baby is having a hard time with spitting. These babies tend to spit right after the feeding. They don't tend to spit, all throughout or in between feedings. They tend to spit right after the feeding. Now, what can you do about that if you tend to be one of those moms that has an oversupply of milk? Now, these babies oftentimes look like babies with reflux. They may pull off, they may gag, they may spit, they may be real irritable, and feeding may be really difficult because they pull off and on and off and on and off and on and tend to fight at the breast a lot. So sometimes that works itself out after a couple of weeks. Sometimes it doesn't. Positioning helps a lot with these babies. So I'm going to show you with a little baby doll what you might help with. And sometimes it's hard to know, but maybe trying some different positioning may help. So let me see if I can turn the camera down a little bit. So you have a baby here. And if you're holding your baby in a typical cradle hold position, and maybe you're sort of leaning over, the baby is kind of downhill from the breast, and gravity flow is kind of pouring that milk down into the baby's mouth. If you have an overproduction of milk or an oversupply of milk, or you have a rapid milk ejection reflex, your baby will choke just because you're getting this, extreme flow of milk toward the baby. If you can change your position, that may help your baby a lot. So if you can lean back and just holding the baby in the same cradle hold position, but if you can lean back so that the baby is kind of more uphill, so the flow of milk isn't pouring down at the baby, that will help. If you can lean back even more, so the first thing you want to do is just get yourself comfortable, maybe lay back on the sofa, so you're even having the baby even higher on the breast. That will help a lot. The baby has to kind of work harder at the breast. Another position would be if you're doing the football hold, that may help. The baby's kind of sitting up and you're having the baby more upright. And even if your baby gets bigger and you're still having that position, if you'll have the baby straddle you, I don't know if you can see this very well, but there you go. If you have the baby straddle your body like this, and the baby's sitting upright, and the baby is facing you just straight on, then that's going to let the baby control the flow of milk more. And those are positions that really help you. And if we go back to talking later on about reflux, these are good positions for reflux babies as well. So the baby is actually controlling the flow of milk. So those are some good things to try. If that doesn't work for you, you can actually slow down the flow of milk with your fingers by actually kind of clamping off above the nipple and just slowing that flow down just a little bit. So if you have a baby that's really clamping down, if the baby's like really gulping at the breast, if you can just kind of slow that flow down a little bit for the baby, that will help. So you just kind of press on the breast and slow that flow down a little bit and let up. The other thing that you can do is if you know when you're feeling that milk ejection reflex if you take the baby off the breast and let your milk flow, maybe into a towel or a cup, or catch that flow of milk and then put the baby back on after the milk lets down. Another thing that you can do, and I recommend this for a lot of people, is to get your milk to let down first. So this works really well with babies who are really hungry and they fight at the breast because they don't like to be patient. Let's go ahead and use your hand and express to get your milk to let down first, and then put the baby on. And then the baby doesn't get that rush of milk when they're feeding really fast, trying to get the milk down. So just expressing and getting your milk to let down first. So those are some tips that you can try if you think that your baby's spitting because of oversupply of milk. So those are some things that you can try there. The next thing would be a milk protein allergy. Now, the signs of milk protein allergy, typically the biggest sign is if your baby has blood in the stool. So if you ever see blood in the stool, that's a sign that you would want to talk to your healthcare provider about. Now, you would see that mostly with babies who are formula feeding, and formula feeding with a milk-based formula. But moms who breastfeed can also have babies that have milk protein allergy. And because you get some crossover of milk in the breast milk. So blood in the stool is one thing that you see. But you can also have some spitting up with that. And so you might want to do a little trial and see if milk protein allergy may be the reason why there. Now, how do you do that? You want to switch the baby off of a milk protein based formula for about 2 weeks. Now, the way that you would do that would be you would need to have an extensively hydrolyzed formula. And that's a formula that you're going to have talk to your pediatrician about. And that would be something like Alimentum or Nutramigen, or maybe one of the amino acid based formulas. You could just do a trial of that for 2 weeks and see if your baby stops spitting. If your baby stops spitting, then that's a good idea that may be what's going on. If you have a breastfed baby, you don't want to put your baby on formula. But mom can do a trial of 2 weeks without any milk, and a good idea to stop eggs as well. And you also need to stop soy, because if your baby's allergic to milk, there's a good likelihood they're allergic to soy too. So that means you're going to have to read labels, because you need to avoid casein and whey, as well as any kind of dairy. 2 weeks is about the time it takes to get that all out of your system, so you're not going to see anything right away. But if you can avoid milk products for 2 weeks, you can see if your baby will improve. If your baby stops spitting, then it may have been a milk protein allergy, and then you'll need to continue on with that. And then you need to use some other kind of milk substitute for yourself. If your baby stops spitting with a hydrolyzed formula, then you'll need to talk about keeping your baby on that for the first year of life. So a milk protein allergy may be a reason why your baby's spitting. The last reason is reflux. And this is typically what people immediately go to when their baby's spitting. They think, oh, my baby's spitting up, my baby must have reflux. I would try all of these other reasons first before you jump right away to thinking about reflux. Reflux is very common because babies have physiologic reflux. All babies have reflux at some point in time. Reflux just means that the baby's spitting stomach contents back up into their esophagus, and sometimes it comes all the way up out of their mouth, and sometimes it comes out of their nose if it's really forceful. Like how bad it is doesn't mean, it's horrible because it came out of the baby's nose. It just means it was forceful. But what do we need to talk about with reflux? Well, all babies have some reflux because that's just physiologic. Babies just do that. But when is it a problem? And that's the difference. Is it a problem? Is it not a problem? The problem has to do with if the baby's having some complications from it. So what are the complications? Well, we have what we call happy spitters, which are babies that just spit up. And they may spit up a little bit, or they may spit up so much that they're, soaking their clothes, or everybody who picks them up gets some spit up on their shoulder. Or we have babies who are not gaining weight. We have babies who are fussy. We have babies who are extremely irritable. We have babies who are getting frequent respiratory viruses. Babies who are having even, to the point of pneumonia, asthma, those kind of problems. Those are the problems where you really need to intervene. So physiologic reflux, physiologic spitting up versus spitting up with complications. Now, just because your baby doesn't have complications, maybe you just have a happy spitter, doesn't mean that you don't want to do something about it. Well, some babies will spit up immediately after a feeding. Some babies will spit up positionally, and that's a really good cue that your baby has some reflux. So if you feed your baby feeds really well, either from the breast or the bottle, and then you lay your baby down to change the diaper, and then milk just comes pouring out of your baby's mouth, that's a good sign that might be reflux. If your baby's spitting but from one feeding to the next feeding, that could be reflux, or it could be overfeeding too, either one of those. If you put your baby in the car seat and your baby's spitting up, that could be reflux. And the reason is you're putting some pressure on the baby's belly, and that's causing some reflux. If sometimes that milk will come up and it'll look just like milk, sometimes it's curdled, and that just means it's sitting in the stomach a little longer. So what do we want to do about that? The recommendations for any reflux, whether it's physiologic reflux, your baby's just a happy spitter, or whether there are complications, you want to start with these basic things. The first is positioning. So you want to kind of keep your baby upright, because what's happening here? There's a little muscle that connects the esophagus to the stomach, and sometimes that muscle's just not very tight, or sometimes it doesn't stay tight, or it loosens up kind of erratically. So the milk will just kind of, regurgitate back up into the esophagus. I kind of think of it as like you forgot to put the top back on the salad dressing, and you're shaking it up, and oops, there it comes, all back out. So the same thing happens with the baby. Your baby feeds, and then you jostle your baby around, and because there's not something really keeping it down in the stomach, it just kind of sloshes back out. So after you feed your baby, if you can keep your baby more upright for about 30 minutes, that will help that milk to kind of digest a little bit before you lay your baby back down. So it's not a big full, tummy full of milk. Now, how do you keep your baby upright? Well, you don't want to put your baby in the car seat. Why is that? Because when you sit your baby in the car seat, their legs are kind of pulled up underneath them. So here's your little baby. And if you sit your baby in the car seat, it kind of pulls their legs up like this. When it pulls their legs up like this, it puts some pressure on their tummy, and that's just going to make them spit up more. So if you have your baby upright, you want to either hold your baby kind of up on your shoulder, and you want to get their legs down so that their back is really straight and their tummy is really straight. You don't want to have them kind of kinked up like this. So any kind of position where you can have your baby upright and their body straight is a good position. Another position would be maybe at a 45-degree angle with their legs straight. And the things that work really well for those would be maybe your bouncer seat, but not a bouncer seat that keeps your baby sitting like this. A bouncer seat that's more like the sling type bouncer seats, where it just has the strap up between the baby's legs and the baby's sort of at an angle and they're just laying there. Or even a swing that's a little bit more straight where the baby's just kind of laying. And you don't want to really have a lot of motion there. Just leave the baby alone, upright for about 30 minutes so the baby can let that milk digest. Now, what about upright sleeping? You don't want to have your baby sleeping in an inclined sleeper. And there are lots of reasons why that. If you know anything about your SIDS recommendations, you know that inclined sleeping is a risk for SIDS. So any of the sleepers that are inclined sleepers are going to put your baby at a risk for SIDS because their neck and their head drop down, and it can cut off their flow of oxygen. So babies with SIDS, it's not recommended that they sleep upright, only that they stay upright just long enough for their milk to digest. And that's for all babies, even babies who have complications. Your specialist will actually give you some recommendations if they want your baby to sleep upright. That's pretty rare. So after about 30 minutes, then you can lay your baby down to sleep. Now, people are oftentimes concerned that laying their baby down, should they spit up, they might aspirate. But we know that a flat position is the best position for babies to be in, even if they're going to spit up, because they're going to be able to spit up and they're going to protect their airway when they do that. The on their back position is going to allow their milk to come out and to spit right out. Is in the position where the milk will come out and the esophagus protects their airway, and that milk is not going to go into their airway. So the esophagus is on the top and their airway is underneath. So they're not at a higher risk for aspirating. But if they're on their tummy, that actually is an increased risk for them to aspirate that milk. And another thing that you can do is you can keep your baby's tummy less full. So you can feed your baby smaller feedings, but more frequently. We obviously need to keep the baby satisfied, and we want the baby to grow. But if you feed your baby a big full feeding, the baby's tummy is going to be fuller. The more full the baby's tummy is, the more likely they are to spit. But if you feed the baby more frequently, but with smaller amounts, then the tummy has less milk in it, and then they're less likely to spit. Or maybe feeding your baby every 2 hours breastfeeding instead of every 3. If you could feed your baby every 3 hours, you're going to be more hungry and they're going to eat more. So just something like that. So feeding your baby more frequently, but less amount. And then sometimes thickened formula will help the baby. So if they're, with the goal being that you're kind of weighting that formula down in the baby's tummy. And you can do that with rice cereal or with the thickened formulas. And some of the recommendations say that the thickened formula might be a better option. But you can talk to your pediatrician about that if your baby's spitting so much that you really have a concern that they need to keep that formula in their tummy. So that's an option there. Now, what about medications? Because everybody wants to, stop that spitting up, and so they think that maybe putting your baby on medications might be an option. Medications do not stop your baby from spitting up. The medication only stops the acid production, and so that stops the irritability and the erosion and the heartburn that's associated with the spitting up. So putting your baby on an acid suppression medicine or one of the other medicines like Zantac or a PPI is not going to make your baby spit up any less. It's only going to stop some of the symptoms. So if your baby is very irritable, is very fussy, is having what you think may be some heartburn associated with their spitting, then a medication might be an option for your baby. If your baby's having reflux with what we might be thinking is erosion or esophagitis, then those medicines are something to consider. But putting your baby on a medication just because they're spitting, and certainly for a baby who's considered a happy spitter, those medications are not an option. And there are a lot of concerns about medications, particularly side effects of the medications. And there are many side effects of these medicines. So it's not something to be considered lightly. There was a time period where almost all babies who had reflux got put on some medicines, but now we know that these medicines have a lot of risks and you don't want to put them on them for long periods of time. So for babies who just spit, even every feeding, unless there's some complications, medication should not be considered. Now, what about babies who are not growing, not gaining weight, they're falling off their growth curve, either not growing or losing weight, babies who are really, really fussy, really irritable, then those are babies that would be considered babies who are having complications. That's gastroesophageal reflux disease. And the babies who are in that category of disease need to have some medical management. And then those babies might need to have a workup. So they might need to have some tests run. They may need to go see the gastroenterologist, and medication management might be an option for them. Lifestyle changes are really what you really want to consider with babies with reflux. Changing the frequency of their feedings, keeping them upright, changing their feeding schedule, and just getting past it. When do they outgrow reflux? I saw a lot of comments that said, oh, babies outgrow reflux at 6 months. Well, some babies do, some babies don't. Some babies only have a problem in the first month or so of life. They should gradually get better, and that's the thing. You should see them get better and better and better. And usually by a year, they have outgrown their reflux. But some young children have reflux. Some older children have reflux. There's no magic number that says when they're going to outgrow it. It's just a matter of time. And there's no magic number. It just depends on how much reflux your child has and what the reason is for it. So you really have to do what's called symptomatic treatment. So those are 4 reasons why your baby might have some spitting up. And you just have to try to sort of figure that out. If your baby's a happy spitter, you need to make sure you got burp cloths every time you pass your baby off. What are some myths associated with spitting up? Let's just talk about those. Food allergies in moms may or may not be an answer. Certainly milk allergy is worth a trial. And if your baby's spitting up a lot, then it's certainly worth spending 2 weeks and adjusting your diet. And I would do that absolutely before I put a baby on medication. But as far as other foods in your diet, you could keep a food log if you wanted to, but you are most likely not going to find a particular food in your diet that causes spitting up in your baby. Except for dairy or a milk protein allergy, it's very unlikely that there is a particular food that's causing your baby to spit up. There was another question that said that breastfed babies don't produce stomach acid, and so they can't have reflux, and that is absolutely not true. We all produce stomach acid. All babies produce stomach acid. The issue with breastfed babies is that the breast milk is digested much faster, and so breastfed babies don't tend to have as many symptoms as formula-fed babies. But breastfed babies can have reflux just as much as other babies do too. They just aren't as symptomatic as formula-fed babies. But breastfed babies produce stomach acid and they reflux too. There was also a question about tongue tie and lip tie. And unless your baby's having some other kind of latching on problems, I wouldn't think that tongue tie is the cause of your baby spitting up. If your baby's having some trouble latching on, and if you're having some discomfort with latching, if your baby's having weight gain problems, then your baby may not be able to latch effectively, and that may be related to a tongue tie problem or a lip tie problem. But just spitting alone would probably not be related to a tongue tie or lip tie problem. If you have those other problems in relationship to spitting, so if you're having breast discomfort, your baby's not gaining weight, and your baby's spitting, then I would certainly look at tongue tie as an issue, but not just spitting alone. So the 4 types of problems, just to review, that you might look at if your baby's having a lot of spitting would be overfeeding, and that would be the one that I would look at first. Oversupply and an overactive milk ejection reflex, milk protein allergy, and gastroesophageal reflux. So look at those, see if you can figure out some reasons why your baby might be spitting and some things that you can do about that. And if you have any other questions, I would be happy to answer those for you. And you can put some comments below and come on over to the Dream Baby Cafe website, maybe check out the playground and see if we can answer some of the questions and get your baby to stop spitting up. Thanks. Bye-bye.